legislation over the single market services, for example, the non-compliance of the European Court of Justice decisions that impeded trade unions to organise and in fact to be individual members of a trade union. We wanted to see the end to the question of competitive tendering and the franchising process and the ending of the fourth railway package and the ability to take decisions regarding state ownership and interventions and continued compliance with the European Court of Human Rights. Gov and Johnson's Living Up agenda is a con and a misnomer. It's designed as a power grab through the Subsidy Control Bill, which became law in April. This bill is favourably disposed of handing out subsidies to the private sector, but doesn't recognise that public ownership should be an option. It's clear that Westminster will have the final say on any action that disrupts commercial market forces, undermining Scotland's powers of public sector intervention. Any contracts and infrastructure investment will only be given or granted under the Internal Markets Act, whereby the rules allow Westminster to override any attempts by local councils to purchase service locally. In other words, overall control for the benefit of the Tories' capitalist friends and businesses. That in itself spells out what the government intentions really are. It's to retain a grip on economic policy throughout the UK and to prevent devolved governments adopting radical different economies. The Internal Market Act, the Subsidy Control Bill, and the Green Paper on Public Procurement are all designed to give them direct interventions into devolved economies, with no regard whatsoever to the provisions of the Scotland Act. And they're now talking about introducing a Bill of Rights to replace the European Convention of Human Rights. Well, we all know what a Bill of Rights means for the Tories, don't we? And they started pontificating recently as the other day as a consequence of my union taking national strike action. And I'm really pleased that things are going well as far as the union is concerned, and indeed the support and the mobilisation we've had from other trade unions over the last week. Colleagues, I could go on, but I have to set out why we are campaigning. We produce bulletins. We regularly do write-ups regarding detailed briefings. I've got the joint secretaries here of the committee, John Foster and Vince Mills, and tonight's agenda for debate is Scotland's future and Johnson's centralising agenda. Our panel of speakers are, first, Helen McFarlane, Unite National Executive Committee member. Helen regularly is a contributor to Rose and, of course, the People's Assembly in Scotland. And in fact, anytime you lift the phone or send an email to Helen to speak at meetings, she gladly obliges and attends, subject to diary commitments. On my right, not necessarily politically either, is Joe Cullinane, Labour Council, Labour leader on the council in North Ayrshire. And Joe continues to promote the principle of community wealth building. And Joe is also a regular contributor as well. And I just found out, it just shows you I don't read everything, that North Ayrshire is not in Labour control. But that'll no stop Joe and his team arguing for the community wealth building programme and ideas that they have. Is Matt here yet? No. Matt Kerr was doing to speak because of one, Craig Anderson, the regional secretary of the CWU, has been waiting a long time to go into hospital for an operation, and they gave him a date today. So I'm sure you'll join with me and wish Craig all the best for a successful outcome to his operation. We had suggested that perhaps you could appoint somebody else, Craig, and he's come up with Matt Kerr, who is obviously a councillor, and he's agreed to step in. Matt, for your information, was a former political officer of the CWU. And lastly, I want to welcome Stephanie Martin, Stephanie is our local community campaigner from Wyndford and Maryhill. She's helping to lead the campaign on cheap, sustainable energy, calling on the City Council to replace the South of Scotland Electricity Board as the power supplier for the council. The heat and power scheme that supplies the estate, and of course, to introduce a council-owned power utility. And I wish you well in your endeavours in that regard. And I'm also pleased to see a young person getting involved. I don't know what age, and I'm not going to ask, but you're younger than me. So therefore, it's very important, that we try and mobilise young people to get involved in the politics of the country. So what I'm proposing is this, that each speaker will address the body of the hall for 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for questions and brief contributions. And I'll finish up by giving a punt for the organisation about affiliation and advise you of the website and stuff like that. For your information, we've got 12 people on Zoom and there's 20 in attendance. I've just introduced you, Matt, in your absence. All right, mate. So, first up then, in no particular order of preference, is Ellen. I'll just put that down. Ellen McFarlane, please welcome Ellen, Unite NEC member, who's going to address you for 10 minutes. Ellen.
Hi, everybody. And Chair, sorry, but I'm just going to muck up things already. So I'm not going to speak for the whole of my 10 minutes. I'm also going to involve Carole Mochan, who's here, who's an MSP in the Scottish Parliament, and Pauline, who's on the Zoom call. Because what I want to get Pauline, who's in the House of Lords and therefore involved in the legislative process as far as Lords is concerned. So I want you to hear in terms of our parliamentarians, if you like, in terms of bring that aspect to this discussion as well. So thanks very much for the opportunity to come and speak. As you say, I'm on the Unite Executive Council representing Scotland. I'm here speaking obviously in a personal capacity, but so I'm coming at this from a trade unionist perspective. That's the starting point I wanted to say. So the power grab, essentially, which is the kind of shorthand of what's going on here, the TUC a good while back now had produced a paper which they also called the Levelling Up paper, which was about the role of state aid. And they came up with, or we collectively through the TUC came up with 5 principles that any post-Brexit state aid regime should adhere to. And so this is from a trade unionist perspective, and I think it's the right starting point. What is it that we should be seeing? And then what is it that we're asking our parliamentarians, therefore, to do on our behalf and to deliver the political response that we'll be busy doing the trade union response. So 5 principles. One, that any policy should be supporting decent jobs through, in particular, public procurement processes. So making sure that we're about employment standards, that there's a commitment to skills and development of staff, and that there's a commitment to environmental implications as well through any procurement. So number 1 was decent jobs. Number 2 was accountability, making sure that any deals, that there's transparency, that there's none of this secret, tap on the shoulders and mates of the Tory party that gets given huge deals, that there should be transparency, and that citizens can easily see who is actually running services using taxpayers' money. And my example of that, I work for the health service, my example of that down south is huge amounts of the NHS down south is using the label NHS, but right underneath that label is private companies, whether it's Richard Branson's stuff or whether it's Serco or tons and tons and tons. So that kind of example of it's not transparent, it would give you the impression that it's the NHS as we know it, publicly funded. So accountability and transparency. The 3rd principle is about making sure that funds are being used to support regional and national developments, and making sure that those kind of funds for development is delivered in a partnership way, and that trade unions are around the table. So that was the 3rd. The 4th is making sure that we target support for industries and we attach conditions, unlike the furlough scheme there, where conditions are things like making sure that during furlough time, staff not only got some wages, but also got some chance to develop their skills, which was what part of the trade union ask was. So those kind of conditionality, that if funding is going in supporting industries, it's on the condition that they employ people on decent jobs, that they do contribute to the UK economy, that they are paying fair tax, they are contributing to the tax base. And the fifth principle was making sure that a good trade deal with the EU made sure that as a minimum, we maintain the EU standards in terms of employment details as well. So at STUC, at our Scottish Trade Union Congress earlier this year, we also passed policy which included policies around fair work and making sure, I mean, this is a quote from one of the policies that was passed, our exit from Europe means we are no longer bound by European laws and directives with regard to procurement. So, and that's a fact, but the SNP wouldn't let you think that. So if we take examples like BIFAB, we take examples like the Calais, where we lost jobs here in Glasgow or whatever, the excuse that was given time and time again has often been, we have to adhere to European procurements, and so jobs went elsewhere, contracts went elsewhere. Well, we're not bound by that anymore. So if the SNP wants to continue to hide behind that as their reason for why they're not investing and not having an industrial strategy and investing in jobs here, then you know, we're not getting any of that Brexit potential for that's to our benefit as working people. The Tories have come out with their policy statement post-Brexit. They're putting a lot of focus on things they're claiming they've already delivered. They're talking about things like claiming back control, and their example for how they think they've delivered that. I don't know if anybody else had to renew their passport recently. We've now got black passports, printed, by the way, in France, not using our own. Unite is the union that organises print workers, not using our unionised, organised workplaces to print those black passports right now. So there's one example. Another example that they're claiming is regulatory freedoms is the language of the Tory party. And what do we mean by that? In the health service, where regulation really matters because it's about patient safety. Regulatory freedoms means you don't have to worry to adhere to standards anymore. So that's what the Tories' version of post-Brexit is, and that's what we need to guard against. So the trade union role in all of this is about jobs, it's about pay, it's about conditions, it's about us focusing and concentrating on making sure that we're doing our part in securing those decent jobs that come out of public procurement funding. So I want to just bring in Carole to just say a few words from the Scottish Parliament point of view, where some of this legislation and attempts are being made to try to secure some decent activity in Scotland around procurement. And then Pauline, if you're okay to, we'll put you on speaker as well, and Pauline Bryan, who's in the House of Lords.
Thanks very much. So I'm Carole Mochan, I'm one of the Labour MSPs, and I've come from a week in Parliament, which has been very busy, and I think it just sets the scene about where we're at. Is so in the Scottish Parliament, we do not an awful lot most of the time in terms of the debates are mild, not political. They're just sort of welcoming things and speaking about, you know, important days, but not actual political decision making. And then in the last couple of weeks, they tried to bung in all the legislation, and we sat there for, you know, till 10 o'clock at night debating things. And I'm not sure. I wasn't a parliamentarian in the last, you know, government, so I'm not sure if that is just a thing of the Scottish Parliament or whether that is a thing of the current government. So in terms of what, you know, the flyer said about can Scotland move away from Johnson's right-wing agenda, then yes, we can. And as Helen has pointed out, and I'm sure other speakers will talk about, there are, you know, even before we broke away from the EU, there was things that we could do. And there certainly are things that we can do now that we're not bound by a lot of things. Now, the SNP are very much, you know, talking that they will not be bound by Boris Johnson's agreement. There's some cross-border things that they can change, but that they won't take that on. I think they're doing it, Pauline might know better than me in this, slightly different to what the Welsh Parliament are saying. But I think the point that we are trying to make in the group is that that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to move away from the sort of EU neoliberal stuff when they have that opportunity to do that. And that is quite apparent when you're there. You know, I think I knew that before I went to the Scottish Parliament, but when you're there, it is very apparent. So we know that the Scottish Parliament can do a lot. I've got some stuff here if anybody wants to ask me more in depth. I must say that I'm not an expert in this area at all, really. People like Richard Leonard and Katie Clark, Paul Sweeney, they're all, you know, very good on these. So please, if you need some further information that's much more detailed, much more forensic, I think Katie in particular is very, very good on this stuff. But so they have the ability to look particularly at land, transport, procurement around local authority, which we know there has been very good examples from, but that has not been pushed and distributed out across the local authorities. And when they give examples, if you ask anyone out with the Parliament, even the third sector, when you speak to them when the government's not there, and you ask them where's the best example, North Ayrshire is always given as the best example. If you hear them talk in the Scottish Parliament, they don't talk about North Ayrshire because the stuff that North Ayrshire did is actually what we want to do. And I describe it, Helen's given me this term, as sweeties. They throw some sweeties at some patches across Scotland, but don't actually then follow up and make it work. So I don't want to take up too much of people's time, but I was just talking to Frida there, and I think one of the key things that maybe people will not realise is they have all the votes in the Parliament. You know, the way the voting system works with the Scottish Greens and the SNP is really difficult for us to break through and get any votes. And the backbenchers are absolutely not political at all. There is no politics discussed in that Parliament unless a number of certain Labour MSPs get up and speak. And that is a problem for Scotland. You know, no matter what side of the debate you are on, it is a problem that we have backbenchers who will not stand up to the front bench. And being in the Parliament, you see that very, very clearly. And that is a real problem for us. I think probably I always try to finish on what can we do? And I think there are things that we can do. The reality is the Parliament doesn't do a huge lot. But at times when there's bills coming through, we can push through amendments. We can put pressure on the committees if we get the right evidence into the committees. And there's a petitions committee as well, which I think we could probably make more use of. And so I would encourage people in this room to think about how they might help some of the MSPs that are very keen to get some changes made on those issues. And the next big bill is National Care Service. Okay.
I mean, as has been said, that this particular procurement bill, which is actually in the House of Lords now, it's going to its committee stage on Monday week, is tied in with the subsidy control bill, the UK internal market, and in fact the whole approach through levelling up of sidelining the idea of devolution. I've now come to absolutely understand that the Tories just do not accept devolution. It's just something to be overcome, not something to work with. You've heard from Carole about Scotland. Wales has a slightly different view in that they think there are things within the bill that they can actually use to their advantage. They see it an opportunity to use the legislation as we're leaving the EU, which is a different approach to the Scottish government, which sees staying in alignment with the EU as fundamentally important, whereas the Welsh are looking to see what changes can come out of the EU that maybe give them more freedoms in terms of making their own structures and policies around procurement. They did oppose the other legislation, so procurement they are seeing as different to subsidy control and the internal market. So it is worth, I think, if you get the chance to consider what the Welsh are saying. There are amendments going forward to the procurement bill in the House of Lords. I hate to say it, but the House of Lords has become the place where you actually get amendments tabled because of arrangements that anything tabled in the Lords has to be taken, whereas that isn't the case in the Commons. So Monday week on the 11th, John Hendy in particular, he's a QC who's in the Lords and he's a specialist in industrial law. He'll be tabling amendments, first of all, putting the onus on the people bidding in the procurement to give evidence of their good industrial relations policies, rather than trade unions having to, find evidence themselves. So it's just tilting the balance of it, but also making trade union rights central to the procurement process. There will be other amendments that will come up before then. So there might be some moderations to it, perhaps probably not enough to satisfy us, but it does, and I'm sure this will come up later, it is different to the EU's approach in that it starts from a more liberal underpinning that says you can do what you want in procurement until somebody challenges you. It's the challenge that's the problem, and that's almost inevitable from multinational companies and others. What I would say, just very, very briefly, is that this is a constitutional issue as well as an industrial strategy, economic policy, trade union issue. It is also constitutional because they are, as is said, making a power grab on much of the devolved settlement. With the procurement, my worry is that the Scottish government's approach to it isn't ours. They want to keep alignment with the EU. So I'll stop there and let you get on with the other speakers. But thanks for the opportunity to say a few words.
Thanks, Pauline. Just as a point of information, you mentioned the Welsh Parliament. I should have said in my opening remarks that we got a message from Beth Winter, who is the Labour MP in Wales, and she sends her best wishes for a good meeting tonight. Beth has contributed to some of our bulletins and stuff like that in the past, and she spoke at one or two of our regular meetings. And I'm sure Pauline and others, especially John Hendy, regarding the amendments, that's absolutely crucial, in my view, about people bidding for the contracts and under the procurement bill, knowing that the rights of trade unions is inescapable and it should be enshrined within the contract. That in itself will guarantee collective bargaining and all the rest of it. So thank you for that. Our next speaker then is, of course, Joe. And Joe, the floor is yours. Thanks very much for attending tonight. And of course, I know your pet subject is, of course, the community wealth building, but I don't know how successful you will be now. You're no longer the leader of the council, Joe. But in the meantime, welcome, comrade, and thanks very much for your attendance here tonight.
When you say my pet subject's community wealth building, Keith had said it's booked until 10:30, so plenty of
That's tomorrow morning. He's
right, okay, magic, that's even better. So my pet subject is probably community wealth building, to be fair, over the last few years, and that's just because under my leadership, North Ayrshire Council was the first local authority in Scotland to take a community wealth building approach to economic development, looking at what's been happening in other parts of the world, primarily Preston, under the leadership of my good friend Matthew Brown, but a lot of cities and states, etc., are involved in community wealth building in America as well. So it really is a kind of global movement for economic change at the end of the day, and it's an approach to local economic development, which I think recognises the flaws of traditional economic development that's been done over the last 4 decades. So if you look at North Ayrshire, for example, we were one of these local authorities that went through the post-deindustrialisation period under Thatcher. We saw big employers leave the region. Carole will know this as well from an East Ayrshire perspective. Thousands of jobs lost over the 1980s, and those jobs have never come back. And part of the reason they've never come back is because we just fell into the traditional economic development model. The councils were traipsing about looking for inward investment opportunities, hoping that the inward investment would come, and if it ever did arrive, the benefits would just trickle down to our communities. Well, in Ayrshire, the inward investment never ever came, but if it did come, we know that trickle down economics doesn't benefit our communities, it benefits capitalism and the folk who hold the economic power in our economic system. So we can continue to play that economic game and expect to get different outcomes, or we can look at alternative options, and that's where community wealth building landed on my desk. It landed on my desk because I was looking at the resources that we had as a local authority and wondering how we could actually use them to create a more democratic, sustainable and fair economy. And for me, community wealth building was the means to do that. I was looking at the financial resources that we had at our disposal. I was looking at the physical assets that we had at our disposal, and also the power of our people. And what I mean by people, I mean our residents, but also the vast number of staff that actually work for the local authorities and other public sector bodies, and how that can help shape the local and regional economy. So we started by launching the strategy in May 2020, just a couple of weeks into the pandemic. We've been working on it for a number of years. And when we launched it, it was an action-orientated strategy. It had 55 actions, and it was developed based on the 5-pillar approach that had been set out by some of the think tanks in this space. So the Centre for Local Economic Studies that are based in Manchester were one think tank that we worked with, and then latterly we've been working with some think tanks in America, mainly the Democracy Collaborative. And those 5 pillars are procurement, fair work, land and assets, financial power, and plural ownership of the economy. And usually I would take that in order, but given the discussion tonight is focused quite a bit on procurement, I'll maybe leave that to last, and I'll start to work my way backwards. So what do we mean by plural economy? In terms of community wealth building and our approach to local economic development, it's about not just supporting privately owned businesses, whether they be small, medium or large. It's about democratising the economy, supporting cooperatives, looking at worker ownership alternatives, supporting the establishment of new social enterprises. They are not-for-profit companies because they have a different value base from private sector companies, and they will lock wealth into our local economies. They're not going to up sticks and leave. You're not going to get a social enterprise in Cullinane up sticks and leaving and going to Falkirk, whereas you will actually get that happening with some of the big multinational companies. So supporting that democratisation of the local economy was fundamental and kind of runs through the rest of the pillars, to be honest. Financial power was more about long-term investments. How do we can get flows of investment into our local economy? So we're talking there about the divestment of Strathclyde Pension Fund, not just the divestment away from fossil fuels, but actually direct local investments within the regional economy. The members of Strathclyde region pay a wage deferral into the pension fund, and then they see their pension fund being invested in fossil fuel companies, etc. The argument I was making is, let's get a proportion of that pension fund and start investing it in the regional economy that they live and work. Let's regenerate their communities using their membership funds. That can actually create jobs, it can create regeneration, it can shift us on the direction and journey to net zero if we just make the right economic decisions with the pension fund, and it can still deliver a return to the pension fund. The only way to make a return on a pension fund investment isn't to invest it in stocks and shares. There's very many different ways of doing that, and there's examples all across the world, again, of really progressive pension funds divesting and investing in their regional economy. The other big one in financial power, which we have been exploring for a wee while, is the establishment of a mutual bank. So in the UK, our banking system is very different from the banking system in a lot of other countries. For example, in Germany, they have a network of savings banks. They don't have the same sort of proliferation of high street banks like we have, the big banking companies that we have. And it kind of shielded them to a certain degree from the financial crisis of 2008. There has been a legislative change over the last decade in the UK, which would allow you to establish mutually owned community banks in this country. And there's a number in establishment. One's getting set up in Wales, and they're confident that that might actually be on the high street within the next 18 months. There's other ones being explored in the northwest, be Preston and others around about that region as well. And my argument has always been, let's have one in Scotland. Let's use people's financial deposits with their bank, not just to sit in a bank account at RBS that then they can invest in stocks and shares and fossil fuels, etc., etc. Let's use that again to start increasing flows of investment in our economy. It is about democratising people's money. In terms of land and assets, the public sector owns a hell of a lot of land and buildings, but since the onset of austerity in 2010, what's been happening with public bodies is they've been in a rush to sell it off. They've had budget cuts, and the approach that they've taken is, let's have a property rationalisation strategy. We'll sell off some of our buildings and our land, we'll get a capital receipt in, and as Matt will know, you either use that to square the circle in terms of the revenue budget, or you put it into the capital budget because it's underfunded. As soon as you sell a public asset, the public value is lost forever. It transfers into private ownership, and then that benefit is held in private hands. So what we set out in our strategy with land and assets is, let's reverse that. Let's halt the sale of publicly owned land to private developers, and let's look at how we can repurpose them to put it back into productive use for our communities. So a couple of examples of that. As in Cumbria, we have transferred ownership of the town hall to a community group. We supported them with some money from a community investment fund that we set up. They then secured £2.5 million of external funding, and they're currently turning that vacant building back into a productive asset for the island's economy. And that's going to be a tremendous project when it's completed at the end of this year. We'll get loads of examples of that. The other big one that we did was looked at our land and thought to ourselves, how can we repurpose that in a sort of more innovative way? And we had 2 former landfill sites, and we decided that we were going to turn those landfill sites into council-owned solar farms. So generating the council's own energy and then getting a financial return to the council that we could then reinvest in other projects in the local authority area. And we took the business case for that and then imported that into one of our industrial estates as well. So by the time we left office, we'd approved 3 council-owned solar farms and 3 council-owned wind turbines, which were going to generate 277% of the council's energy needs. And we were looking at the opportunities to sell the excess energy to other public bodies like Ayrshire College, NHS Ayrshire and Arran, etc., keeping that money back in the local and regional economy as well. In terms of recruitment and fair work, North Ayrshire Council is the biggest employer in North Ayrshire. NHS Ayrshire and Arran is the biggest employer in Ayrshire as a region. That gives us huge power to influence the local labour market. It's about whether or not we decide to use that influence to deliver productive, positive outcomes. So a couple of things here. Let's help shape the terms and conditions across the wider labour market. But fundamentally, let's look at how we recruit people. If we recruit people from deprived communities, if we target recruitment policies towards single mothers or people with disabilities, we can intentionally take an approach to our recruitment which takes them out of poverty. And if we do that, then I think that our local and regional economy will be far better for it. The outcomes for the NHS will be completely different. And this is why NHS bodies and boards should be involved in community wealth building, because you're never going to solve the social and health economic inequalities in our communities just by treating them in A&E. You need to improve the economy. if they switch that sort of mindset around and start taking a community wealth building approach to their own resources, then they can improve the economic and social outcomes for their residents. And finally, on procurement, which is obviously of interest here tonight, there's £1 billion a year spent by the public sector in Ayrshire, and a fraction of that goes into the Ayrshire economy. So what we said was we wanted to change that and start spending more of that money with local businesses, not just local businesses, but let's have a longer term strategy to spend more of that with social enterprises, cooperatives, worker-owned businesses, etc. Now, there is procurement issues there, and we've spoke about them just now in terms of competitive tendering and how you can favour local supply chains and that. So one of the fundamental changes that we made as a local authority was before you took a contract and put it onto the portal for people to bid for that contract, and then you get into this legal framework where it gets scored against a matrix and whoever comes out top legally has to be awarded that contract. We said there's a contract there for X. The business development team then went out and animated the local supply chain, the local economy, looked at what local businesses could fulfil that contract and got them prepared to bid and hopefully win that contract. And that was the sort of strategy for that longer term shift in how we would spend more of the procurement money in Ayrshire with Ayrshire businesses, and as I say, supporting social enterprises and cooperatives, etc., to go on the procurement frameworks as well. That takes me very briefly, because I know we're only 10 minutes and probably spoke for longer than that already. Takes me very briefly onto what the Scottish Government are talking about in terms of community wealth building, because they are talking a reasonable game, but I think, as Craig Anderson said in the Morning Star recently, it's all talk and no delivery. They have a community wealth minister, and they have a commitment to a community wealth building act to Parliament. Everything I'm hearing is that this might deliver another public duty on local bodies to deliver a community wealth building plan. It's not going to reform procurement and look at how we can embed fair work, etc., in the procurement process, and how we can strip away some of the competitive tendering to support Scottish businesses to win contracts. It's going to be another tick box exercise unless we organise ourselves to actually do some of the groundwork on what a community wealth building act would look like if we were in charge. And I think there's a bit of work to be done on that. In terms of the debate, Carole, I've got to say it was an appalling debate, and I think even some of the Labour voices that day were appalling, including our spokesperson on these issues. I thought that was an absolutely dreadful speech that Daniel Johnson delivered. I think he showed an absolute lack of understanding of what we talk about when we talk about community wealth building. I was also frustrated to hear folk talking about infrastructure projects like airports and roads in connection with a debate about democratising the economy. The only person that got it in the Parliament that day and got the space to talk really was Richard Leonard, who spoke about the fact that the Scottish economy is dominated by direct foreign investment and the need for us to change that type of approach, and spoke about cooperatives and worker ownership and that. But that will not be a surprise to anybody that knows Richard and his background. He's been talking about these issues for decades. And I think there's definitely a role for Richard going forward to help us shape what this community wealth building act should look like. And in terms of next steps, because I'll finish on that, because I like that for Carole, you should always finish on next steps. First of all, what your union did last week, Phil, is probably the most exciting thing that's happening in the Labour movement at the moment. You are giving confidence to other workers to stand up for their pay and conditions. I think that's where most of our efforts at the minute should be. It shouldn't be in political chambers, whether they be in Westminster, Holyrood, or in council chambers. It should be out in the streets working with the trade union movement to defend their jobs and to argue for a fair wage rise, given where we are. But I think as well as that, there's a bit there where community wealth building can be bent into how we restructure the economy at a national level. And I know the CWU have been great supporters of what we've been trying to do in North Ayrshire, and what people like Matthew Brown's trying to do in Preston. They've completely bought into the idea of community wealth building, which has been great. And I think there's a bit there where we can start to work with unions and use community wealth building in the framework of the 5 pillars to set out an industrial strategy which looked at sector by sector. How do you democratise that sector, looking at how you deliver fair work, build local supply chains, etc. So I think moving beyond just empowering local leaders to do some bits and pieces in terms of taking control of their own local economies and looking at that wider shift that we need to see, there's a bit there that we should absolutely be focusing on the Act and influencing the development of that. But I think we should also be doing a bit of work where we start to work with unions about sectorial plans which are based on the framework of community wealth building. They can democratise the economy, and I think that's us done quite a bit of the groundwork then. We'd be doing that.
Thank you very much. What you've been saying, very interesting indeed.
You're a fast writer.
Well, don't worry about it. I must do the points.
John's recording it.
Did what he wanted.
You could have slowed down.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for your valuable contribution, and especially your solidarity message, and I'll pass that on to the membership and indeed the organisers and others. Just one thing I think people need to be aware of, and it's vital when we talk about fairness. £179 million has been lost to the train operating companies over the 3 days, including the 2 days that people were back at work and trains were all over the place and all the rest of it. But the train operating companies are sitting back because of the fact that the government will indemnify those train operating companies who have lost money caused by industrial action. In other words, there is no enthusiasm to settle because they can sit back knowing that the taxpayers via the government will refund them for the loss. Now, that in itself tells you that the cards are in favour of the class rather than supporting working people. And that's why you've got Sharps and all the rest of them trying to demonise their General Secretary. And he's playing a blinder, by the way, in my view, regarding how he has handled the dispute. But I'll tell you, we're in for the long haul, and it's not going to get sorted until we get justice for our people who have made the sacrifice to ensure that a decent standard of living, the terms and conditions are protected, and indeed we want assurance of no compulsory redundancy. That is our aim, and we use support and the support in the movement. It was fabulous on Saturday that trade unions gathered to give us solidarity support at the picket line. And I've never seen anything like it in my 44 years a member of the union. I haven't seen anything like that before. So thanks very much for that, Joe. But that figure that I gave you, by the way, it's kosher in relation to the amount of money that they have lost, and they'll get reimbursed direct from the public purse. Right, okay, Matt, you're up next.
Right.
Sorry.
No, I'll start off. What you said there, Phil, there about the train operating companies willing to stick it out because they know they're going to get paid by the government. That doesn't only tell you what side the government's on, of course, yes, in terms of the class structures. Also tells you something quite fundamental: is that these organisations shouldn't be in the private sector at all. They can't function without public money at any level. They never could. And they haven't been able to function without public money since the 20s. I mean, it's a completely absurd situation. So it should be back in the public sector. And if we're talking about community wealth, I understand Joe rightly made the point that some people got carried away talking about airports and things like big infrastructure, and that's not what community wealth building is about. But what is public ownership of natural monopolies if it's not holding wealth in the common? I mean, that should be absolutely fundamental to our politics and actually building a fair society. So you can do that sort of things in the national monopolies at the very least, and then you work through what Joe's been doing at a local level. In the CWU, I should say that I'm Craig Anderson today. I think Craig's getting a new shoulder today, so he's presently off his face. And that's how you put it to me. So I'm pretty sure I'm in solid ground saying that. So I'm filling in for him on I should say from a CW perspective, obviously we've just had a ballot result today ourselves, an absolutely cracking result, I have to say, or 3 results actually. Now 2 of them were successful and 1 of them was unsuccessful, but even the unsuccessful was actually a good result, and I'll explain why in just a moment. We done very well in the kind of in the open reach and the BT group ones, but the EE one is the one we lost. And we lost it because we fell short of the turnout quota by 8 votes. 8 votes. Now, I know what it's like to get beat narrowly, right? But that's sore. Right? Now, but the upside of that, though, I have to say, is EE is a company which hasn't been in the BT group for very long. It was only taken in 4 years ago, I think. It's only recognised the CWU 3 years ago, after a bit of argy-bargy, and I have to say Craig Anderson was at the forefront of doing that organising in the workplace against a lot of resistance. So to actually achieve that result is pretty spectacular, I have to say. It might not sound it, but it is. It's a great step forward in an industry which is actually notoriously poorly represented both in the trade union movement and elsewhere. It is the call centres these days are the modern sweatshops in many ways, certainly in this country. Very, very precarious work, very, very low pay, and EE workers were the lowest paid in the whole BT group. So it's unfortunate that they're not able to join with the action, but it's actually understandable that maybe some of them were wary of voting because they still fear reprisals from management in a way that people in the old BT group, if you like, don't, because they have a long-term structure there with the trade union and recognition. Now, Europe didn't save those guys, did it? You know, it doesn't. This idea that we heard earlier on, that the future that the Scottish Government sees is keeping ourselves aligned with European directives and rules on these things, presumably because they want to keep getting people on that we're going back in, is absurd. What a lack of ambition that shows, both for working people and for the country as a whole. The EU floors on these things were poor. We're very, very poor. And most of what we actually ever achieved in this country was won domestically and won through the trade union movement and their action. We could do far better without having to resort to that, I think. I remember being in the council as a social work convener, talking about there's a huge amount, about 60% of social work spend goes outside of the council. Might even be more now, actually. And of course, if the social care, national care service goes through, it'll probably grow again. A lot of that is because of compulsory competitive tendering. A lot of that is actually falls back on the legal advice councils and councillors are given routinely, saying that you have no option. You must offer this up. Now, sometimes you get lucky, and the only people who are interested are local organisations and all the rest of it. Now, but quite often that's not the case, and many, as many trade unionists in this room will know, a great many of the third sector organisations that bid for these things are as good as private corporations these days anyway. They certainly pay their CEOs similarly, and they have a similar kind of attitude towards the rights and terms and conditions of their workers. So I have to say I'm not hearing much from the Scottish Government that gives me much hope. But I'll throw in one other thing. I know I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here, not like me. But I was taken with something Helen said there about EU procurement, and this is a particular Unite issue. The low emission zone is coming into force in Glasgow. Now, some of you will know that the taxi drivers in Glasgow had an issue with that, issue with the implementation of it. I support a low emission zone. In fact, I wanted it in earlier when it was initially proposed. But what's happened in those intervening 2 years is the taxi drivers of this city have had virtually no income whatsoever. They're expected to make in some cases tens of thousands of pounds worth of adaptations to their vehicles, and they've been given, I think they've been given up to £2,000 to assist with that. Right now, you might think, well, you don't want these guys going around pumping out that black smoke around the city and all the rest of it. But I think people have to understand that taxis are a fundamental part of public transport. It's not that it doesn't set alone. It's part of public. You need to have a functioning taxi service if people with, for example, disabilities and you're going to get around the city. You can't just rely on buses. You certainly can't rely on buses. That's for sure. But you get. And I'm sorry, Phil, but quite often you can't rely on the trains these days either. Not because of the strikes, I might add, but because of the service cuts.
No, we want to try and run it early, but you're not allowed to do that.
But not everybody, the point I'm making is not everybody can get on these things. It's an important part of public service. So I was questioning this at committee. And I said, well, why can't we do more to support them? Because they told us they'd given literally millions of pounds to bus companies in the city to make the conversions. Millions of pounds. And I was told, well, we can't do that. European, it's state, you can't do that. European procurement, state. That kept getting repeated. And so I asked the question, well, how did you get away with it with the buses? Oh, we went to the commission and asked for leeway to do it. I said, why didn't you do it for the taxi drivers? Oh, we never thought of that. Do you know why they never thought of that? It's obvious why they never thought of it, isn't it? Because one lump there is a group of multinational companies with massive economic clout, and I have to say massive clout over the government. And the other one is a collective of one-man bands, let's be honest with you, right? If you can have a collective of one-man bands, but you get my point, right? That's the difference. And you think about what these companies like the Gills and First Bus and all that, they're perfectly capable of funding these things themselves. They're highly profitable companies, and they're highly profitable because they're entirely reliant on state subsidy, day in, day out. I've got a notebook handed to me during the last general election. I chapped a door on Dry Road in Govan, and a woman said, I want to speak to you. And she came out with this notebook, and I thought, oh no, what's this going to be? And she kept a scrapbook of all her tickets for a year, all the bus tickets, because she'd been using her bus pass, and she'd been riding the bus along Govan Road into the city centre. And every single ticket said that she was going to Shettleston. Every single one. Right? Dozens and dozens and dozens of these things. And I don't think that's a real bus driver doing that because there's nothing in it for them. They're not in performance-related pay. No, that's a systematic fraud that's going on throughout. Because I hear this all the time. I've seen it now myself as well. And it's rife in the industry. So not only are they getting the subsidies, they're ripping off things at the other end, but they also manage to get around European procurement. So, but that comes for me to the fundamentals when we talk about EU state aid thinking, and that's state aid's okay for the big boys, but not okay for the rest of us. And I also remember state aid coming into play when we were talking about in social work contracts about trying to. Because at one point I was trying to enforce the living wage in it. Oh, this is going back a million years now. And I was told that's state aid. Can't do that. And thereon was a big debate then in the group. So fast forward years later, I'm sitting on the executive committee at Glasgow City Council, or CAC as it's called now aptly. The leader of the council, God bless her, she said, we're going to set up a task force made up of senior officers of the council, all the kind of the great and the good, all the kind of, if you like, the brains of the council, if you like, and that's going to build a plan for us to adapt to the coming catastrophe that was withdrawal from the EU. And I was daft enough to stick up my hand at that point and said, well, as part of that remit, can we look at opportunities as well? Because I understand perfectly well there's lots of difficulties going on. Of course, it's a simple question. We should be looking, any big change, doesn't matter what it is, you should be saying, well, what are the possibilities? What could we do differently? Could we look at procurement? Could we, and that very day, actually, there was a paper going through about living wage in social work contracts. I'm saying there's actually no way of enforcing that. We're asking them nicely. It'd be nice to be able to enforce it. And I was laughed at, not for the first time in my life, but I was laughed at and talked as if I were. In fact, actually, the leader of the council said, "Well, looking at procurement will be a crumb of comfort when people have their wages and their living standards crash as we leave EU." And of course, we all know perfectly well that it's perfectly possible to fight back on these things. if you've got the powers, and also to powers to challenge things. One of the things I really admire about Joe, sorry Joe to embarrass you, is he actually challenged his advice. He challenged his advice on a whole load of things, not least in his, I believe, his first budget. And I think we need to be doing similar, right, at a local government level, on all sorts of things. Who is this employer who's going to come and sue the council for paying somebody properly? Who is that? Bring it on. Let them do it. We'll drag them through the papers. We'll let the world know that they want to go to court, spend tens of thousands of pounds to pay people nothing. Great, go for it. That should be our attitude. That should absolutely be our attitude at every level. And we need to put that challenge to people. It was like that thing with the taxes. Well, who is it that they feared was going to sue there in terms of state? Would be the private cab drivers? Well, it's an easy solution. I'll just give it to them as well. I would have thought that's going to break the bank. Well, it's just this unwillingness to look beyond, and that comes back to something else that's actually that's clear in the public sector. I remember hearing this, some of the older people in the room might correct me on that. I remember hearing a story about the Cullinane government. There's many stories of the Cullinane government. One of them was that basically, in fact, it was Dennis Healy, I think, who came out with this one. He said, I would never have gone through with some of those cuts that I did if I'd known that the North Sea oil was going to start rolling in the way it did. He said, but I was misinformed by the I mean, I don't entirely believe him, right enough. So I was misinformed, he said, by the civil servants. But there's something else that happened amongst the civil service at that time. It had been converted to monetarism. That had happened at that moment. And what has happened, it doesn't matter what government is in, there is a culture, and there's no individual person to blame here, I'm not going to point at it, but there's a culture now that understands nothing else but the idea of outsourcing as the solution to all our problems. And I have to say, Joe deserves a lot of credit for that, for actually sticking his head above the parapet, properly challenging that. But we need more of that. You know, I need to take some of that on in my own council, but many of us are all across the country need to do the same. And we need to do it in the Scottish Parliament. We need to do it in the Scottish Parliament. It's not good enough, for example, when the Cali shut on the basis that we couldn't interfere because of state aid. That's, I mean, well, firstly, you could chat. I think that personally, I didn't really believe that anyway. But what a terrible excuse, especially for a party that says they're so committed to staying in Europe and they want to get back into Europe. And they're the bastion, the beacon of for the party to vote for if you want to get Scotland back into Europe. But we'll shut your heavy industry, shut your industry down because we can't do anything because of Europe. And that is, frankly, piss poor. It's weak from the minister, not being willing to challenge it, because if some officers in Glasgow City Council can go and challenge things about giving money to a bus company, I'm damn sure a minister can challenge it over something like the Cali. That's weak. But secondly, it makes the point about what Europe is about, and it's fundamental. You know, we have to challenge that now. We're not in it anymore. We have to start acting like we're not in it. Look for the opportunities, take them. Things like community wealth building, the opportunities actually broaden with it. Clearly, they quite clearly do. We can start building back into our communities again. See it in my own former industry, if you like, the Royal Mail, which, by the way, we're balloting as well. The Communication Workers Union is about to start a war on 3 fronts, so that should be a hit. So we're already in dispute in the post office, which is still publicly owned, and the Royal Mail was about to begin, and obviously BT is just balloted. The post office stays in the public sector because it never made any money; they couldn't sell it. The Royal Mail was flogged off after nationalising my pension. George Osborne nationalised my pension. What a lovely man. He'd done it so he could cook the books a little bit. And he'd done it so he could take the liability off the company to flog it. But Royal Mail was always a highly profitable company. It was the bit that cross-subsidised into the post office. The whole principle of that cross-subsidy is it goes back to the heart, I think, of what we're talking about trying to do at a local level with this. Well, when you think about what the Royal Mail does, for example, there are Royal Mail operatives in every corner of this land, visiting every address of this land every day, every single day, right? One way or another. They're reliant on the post buses even now. And you're reliant on the one price goes anywhere stamp, even now, as the prices have been cranked up. The real cost of a tenner is a tenner to send a letter to Isla. It's not the 60 odd p or whatever it is now, cranked up again. But that goes to for me the fundamentals of this the principle of common ownership, of thinking about how we use natural monopolies to get more value for the buck. Because the Royal Mail doesn't just deliver letters; it holds communities together. The postal service is at the heart of every community in this land. Something we're talking about in terms of the modernisation of the Royal Mail is actually the role of the postie. Could it be more than just delivering something? Could it be about actually what we do anyway? Is have a blether to people? I've never heard that. A lot of people never see anybody else all day or all week. We could be doing so much more, but you need a creative approach to these things, and you need to break out of it. And a lot of that was torn asunder when the market was liberalised, and then shaped up to be sold off. And we know the challenges that are there in the transport industry around that. So look, I said that just a minute ago that posties blether on. I think I've done enough of that. I've seen Phil doing that, so I'll take my leave now. But thanks very much.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned George Osborne, contribution. I've always maintained that liars can figure and figures can lie. So you can take a pick the way you want it. He's basically when he was Chancellor. Okay, the last speaker tonight is indeed Stephanie Martin, local community campaigner. Stephanie, the floor is yours, my love, and the best of luck to you. We're glad to hear what you've got to say regarding your campaign up in Maryhill.
Thank you. I'm really honoured to be here with you all and to be part of this vital discussion for our class. The future is frightening for young people in Scotland today who are staring down the barrel of a gun in terms of global warming, while drowning in a cost of living crisis exacerbated by Johnson's authoritarian, right-wing attacks on democracy, and with no real alternative on the table from a Scottish government who are determined to divide the working class along nationalist allegiances. The outlook is grim indeed, but today I'm here to discuss possibility, like some of the other speakers we've had, and to outline how, starting from the very grassroots of our communities, community wealth building can be achieved in line with addressing the climate emergency. Through struggle with our neighbours against the vampiric force of the private energy sector and against a callous political elite who uphold it, the working class can save itself from economic peril after enduring decades of austerity, while also alleviating the impending climate catastrophe that awaits us all. As the Rose Statement of Aim sets out, we've got an opportunity now while outside the EU to fight for public sector-led infrastructure programmes in the energy sector. We can force a requirement for contractors to adhere to specified employment conditions that put the worker at the centre. And also we can crucially take power over essential utilities by bringing them into public ownership through local government. But while the EU's legal framework preventing such radical action from hitherto developing has been removed, there still remains a political neoliberal context in our country that is hell-bent on sustaining a broken system of rampant inequality, most demonstrably evident in the private energy sector itself. While some of the most vulnerable among us are spending an average of 54% of their income on bills, SSE have made an operating profit of 1.5 billion in the last year, with a 15% year-on-year increase in profit, according to the BBC. SSE have been owned since 2020 by OVO Energy, the second largest energy supplier in the UK, who have been fined by Ofgem for causing detriment to over 240,000 of their customers. In my own community, the Wyndford in Maryhill, we know too well the callousness of energy companies, as we are one of the most at-risk housing schemes for fuel poverty in the country. SSE were brought in on a Scottish Government district heating network initiative in 2012, which Cube Housing Association were relying on in order to bring its housing stock in the Wyndford up to the decent home standards for energy efficiency and for fuel cost. In 2011, Alex Salmond's SNP government pledged to address fuel poverty and work towards meeting climate change targets by commissioning these heat networks across the entire country. There were also promises made of a publicly owned energy company. Today, there are over 23,000 homes in Scotland supplied by 800 heat networks, and there is no publicly owned energy company. Surprise, surprise. These vary widely in size. For example, in the Wyndford, around 1,800 homes are supplied by a district heating network. This is the biggest housing scheme with a communal heating system in Glasgow, whereas in areas like Kelvindale, the heat network only supplies around 100 homes. It's an environmentally friendly initiative, which involves a distribution system of insulated pipes that carry hot water or steam from a central source to homes within a given zone. They run at a very low cost to energy providers and to the environment. However, in our experience in the Wyndford, they have not run at a low cost to the consumer. Tenants in this area have reported to Wyndford Residents' Union exorbitant rises in their fuel bills to the extent that many are now in debt or having to choose between heating or eating. 80% of these residents had already reported unaffordable heating bills before the COVID-19 pandemic. My own heating bill has risen by 56%. At a time when SSE have reported a 15% yearly increase in profit, and when their CEO, Alistair Phillips-Davies, has just handed himself a 47% pay increase, why are they raising the fuel bills to such an extent? Greed's the answer. But our community has had enough of this blatant rip-off, and we're organising a fight back. Given that the district heating station site is owned by the Housing Association, who are a social landlord, Wyndford Residents' Union have been petitioning Weekly Homes, who have subsumed Cube Housing Association, for a meeting with them and SSE in order to negotiate over these price hikes. The aims of the private energy sector to maximise profit at all costs are directly contradictory to the key founding principle of the district heating system, to alleviate fuel poverty. We believe that SSE are unfit to operate our district heating system, as they demonstrated with their offensively ignorant suggestions that they gave customers just last year to cuddle with your pets or do star jumps if you can't afford to pay your bills. Honestly. The Scottish Government and our Housing Association, on the other hand, believe that they are indeed fit to run this station, and SNC were issued a 30-year lease to rip off the community without redress back in 2012 at the network's establishment. It's undemocratic even within capitalism's own free market terms. In this system, the ideology serves that if a consumer is unhappy with a service, they can simply switch company or product in order to solve the problem. But for those of us living in these district heating schemes, we have no choice over the private energy giant who's going to rip us off. On this basis, the Wyndford Residents' Union has fought for and negotiated settlements with SSE and the Housing Association in previous years. In 2019, for example, the union agreed to SSE's offer of an expanded low user tariff and a pledge not to disconnect any residents' energy due to debt during the winter months. This negotiation was achieved through protest, petition and grassroots campaigning in the local area, as well as outside SSE's HQ in the city centre. Now, however, the conditions have drastically changed, and what we're demanding is a return to the pre-April increased tariff rates. So far, we've released a petition which demands a negotiation with SSE and Weekly Homes, and at this stage, the petition has around 200 signatures from the local community, achieved by doorstepping efforts from our local campaigners. We also held a protest outside the district heating station itself, which was attended by Labour MSP Pam Duncan-Glancy. Pam subsequently penned a letter to SSE and Weekly Homes about the matter, but this was ignored unsurprisingly. The protest was well attended, received good media coverage, and we secured many signatures for our petition. However, we've still been stonewalled by all parties involved. A few weeks ago, we decided to protest again outside SSE's headquarters in the city centre, and the response that we received through the media, not directly to ourselves, was that SSE will only conduct discussions on fuel tariffs with individual customers, not with us as a collective. But what SSE clearly fail to understand here is that a collective issue such as ours can only be resolved through collective bargaining. It's not the case that some of us are being subjected to increased tariffs while others are not. We're all being asked to pay over the buck for energy, which costs SSE next to nothing, energy which is collectively produced and supplied through the district heating scheme. It's actually our waste which is recirculated to produce this energy, and they've got the cheek to charge us the rates they do for it. It makes no sense, therefore, for this private interest to be even involved in what's essentially a public service. Even if we do manage to secure our negotiation, it's very clear that SSE have no interest in agreeing to a return to pre-April prices. As a social landlord, Wheatley Homes have a duty to protect their tenants from deprivation in order to secure their tenancies. They own the property that SSE is currently contracted to operate, and so they must protect the financial security of their tenants by supporting our demands. So there are two clear issues here that the Wyndford Residents' Union are aiming to address. First, we must ensure that social landlords like Wheatley Homes are held accountable to us, the tenants, and not to the profiteering agenda of private energy companies like SSE. Second, we'd like to remove the role of SSE or any other private interest as a third party altogether. We see no use for them and no benefit for them. We want to utilise the power we have while outside the EU to take public ownership of utilities. We need a publicly owned energy company in order to provide energy security to the working class. This is something I believe that we can all agree on, whether or not you live within a district heating zone. But within these zones, there is a unique opportunity to appropriate the infrastructure that is now already being developed and is continuing to be developed in the coming decades in order to meet climate change targets. The Heat Networks Scotland Act of 2021 has set out government plans to accelerate the deployment of these heat networks across the country, with a target of over 650,000 additional homes being connected to heat networks between the years of 2027 and 2030. The plans require local governments to develop partnerships with the private energy sector by giving them long-term permits on the properties to develop and operate the heat networks and develop a customer base that's reliable to them. These plans are complemented by low-rate unsecured capital loans via the District Heating Loan Fund, which has offered over 15 million to 50 different projects since its launch in 2011, alongside a newly established Heat Network Fund that was launched in February this year. These systems have been and continue to be rolled out using public money from the Scottish Government and Housing Association money from our rents. SSE and other private company involvement is directly siphoning money out of some of our poorest communities into the pockets of the rich, including the 4.5 million per year salaried CEO of SSE. And so, with an ever expanding collective basis for energy production and distribution in a time of shared climate concerns, the moment is ripe for action and for campaigning. Wyndford Residents' Union have begun reaching into other communities across Glasgow who are supplied by a district heating system in order to establish a broad base for this campaign, which must have at its core a demand for a publicly owned energy company, similar to what is being launched in Wales now by the Welsh Senedd, a supporting factor in the Welsh Labour Government's community wealth building aspirations. We've got similar aspirations here in Scotland, and our Scottish Government does have the power to take radical action like this, but they haven't got the will. Even the Green Party, supposed environmental socialists, voted down a Labour motion to establish a publicly owned energy company. The STUC, on the other hand, have committed to supporting the establishment of a publicly owned renewable energy company. This demonstrates that the concerns and work of our trade unions is inextricable from the needs of our communities. They are one and the same, whereas the interests of the neoliberal Scottish Government are quite the opposite, and indeed Boris Johnson's centralising government. Therefore, the move by the STUC at the Cost of Living Summit for closer collaboration between trade union organising and community organising is a crucial one if we are to take control of an economy that is spiralling into disaster for the working class and for our planet. If we cooperate as the working class and build the alternative from the grassroots up through campaigns such as the one that we have ongoing in Wyndford, and which is expanding across our city, then we can seize control of our future. Starting from our own communities, we can build a Britain that is no longer subservient to the greedy interests of a capitalist class who own the wealth, into one which serves the working class who produce the wealth. Thanks for listening.
What about that then, Is that not top drawer stuff?
Thank you.
I remember where I saw you. You were at the STUC conference, weren't you?
I was talking about.
Talking about. Well, Stephanie, obviously, best wishes in your endeavours, and you can take a message back for this group that we support everything you're trying to achieve. And you hit a raw nerve, I think, when you mentioned the question of businesses don't like collectivism. Well, we know that. I mean, even a trade unionist for 44 years, they never liked collectivism. and they would rather deal with individuals, hence the reason why any collective bargaining has got the individual grievance procedure enshrined in it, so that people who've got an individual grievance can go to the governor and air that grievance. But 9 times out of 10, they don't get anywhere. So it's academic. Anyway, if they were a member of a trade union, that's what they're there for, to take the grievances collectively into the shop floor. Thanks very much for your contribution. Very interesting indeed. And as I said, we will obviously support you tooth and nail and keep us posted in relation to your efforts. Thanks very much. I was really impressed with your contribution, Stephanie. Right, colleagues, it's 2027. We're supposed to be out of here for 9 o'clock. I wanted to try and get as many questions and from you who may have something to say or something to ask. If you want to speak or raise a question, please let me know, or put your hand up or whatever. If you want individuals to answer the question, then we'll direct it accordingly. If you want the group to answer the question, then that'll take more time. But, you know, does anybody want to ask a fundamental question in relation to what we're about? No? Vince?
It's a question about what we're going, you know, what we're here tonight for, I suppose. And one of the things we didn't really talk about for obvious reasons was the Tory strategy and all of the so-called levelling up and where it's going. And I guess related to that, how the SNP government is dealing with that, and how, as a consequence of the recent events all of the kind of past politics that were raised tonight, the serious danger of disappearing. When people say to Stephanie, oh, it's nice to see when people say to Stephanie, yeah, but see, after we get independence, you won't need to worry about that because that will all be resolved, you know, land of Milton Honey, etc., etc. So to start with those two, just very, very briefly, we are going to have a hard look at what's happened to this Tory strategy of levelling up. Apart from the fact that it's that in order to do things that Johnson says he wants to do, which is to, if not enrich, at least make less poor certain areas in the whole of the UK, then he would need to do a lot more than just putting jobs in there anyway, because some of the big problems are related to things that Stephanie referred to. They're to do with things like poor health, poor housing, and most of all, very poor education and training. So Doncaster, for example, I think it's 5% of folk have got degrees. Brighton, 55% have got, and guess where all the jobs are between those two particular areas. So we need to have a hard look at that strategy and see whether or not they're serious about it. My guess is a lot of it, from the Tories' point of view, it's a bit like some of our governments closer to home are guilty of. There's a lot of rhetoric involved in it, but I'm not sure to what extent it'll actually work. So I mean, I think that's something we need to look at. Secondly, and some people have referred to this already, we've now got a king-size problem in Scotland about avoiding the trap. I don't know if anybody saw Mercedes Villalba's recent tweet. She said she asked the Scottish Parliament what the Scottish Government was going to do about capping rents. And she was told that her problem was she supported the current Tory Westminster setup. Right? In other words, that is going to be the nature of the debate. So to factor back in, it's how do we connect the kind of struggles that we've heard about tonight, like Joe's campaign to try to root economic development in communities, and Stephanie's to cut rents. So how do we actually link that to a response to the national question, which allows us to offer an alternative to the binary offer we're getting at the moment? So we need to think through that as well. And that, just to finish this point, this isn't something we can postpone. This is absolutely urgent. If we do not resolve this, and for the next 3 years at least, we're going to get nothing but nationalist and unionist politics, and class politics will be absolutely sidelined.
And if that is going to be, in my personal opinion, the terms of reference for casting your vote, then I'm not having it as an individual voter. And that's what we need to do, you know, to get that message across the dangers of getting back into the European Union. Because Jim Sillars once said at one of the meetings that we were at, yes, he can understand leaving a capitalist club at Westminster, but not to join another capitalist club in Europe. And he couldn't see the sense of that. And of course, that's one of the reasons why I suppose that Jim is actually the president of the organisation, and he'll be campaigning and all the rest of it. So the terms of voting in the referendum needs to be clearly spelled out in the different papers and all that kind of stuff. We need to be on the ball, by the way, in my view. Scotland has got a right to choose, but at the end of the day, what we have to do is to make sure the real dangers about getting back into Europe. And do we think then that the Scottish government, if they get independence vote, that they're going to go in without any restrictions? It's going to be back to the same old, same old. The European Court of Justice, the question of procurement, the question of competitive tension, it's all going to be there because that's the term of entry in relation to those waiting to join. And therefore, Scotland's not going to be any different, in my view. But I might be long gone before that happens, but heaven knows the situation. But, I'll be doing what I can do as an individual, using whatever organisation I'm a member of to do so. Now, look, is that, Vince, I think, that's a to-do list, for us, by the way, as an organisation, in relation to how we're going to communicate and get the message across, etc. Is there any other questions that anybody wants to ask? No? Yep. Frida, quickly, if you don't mind.
It's a good question, but I mean, my heart did sink at the possibility, just to follow on with Vince, about how politics is going to be cast in Scotland, and as they grind their way through the Supreme Court and keep getting knocked back to whether the Scottish people will be politics, just the whole scenario. But I think the difference is this time there are not actual real class struggles taking place, which we've just heard about. And that's actually real, and it can't be made to just go away, or the demand made that folk defer their aspirations to some mirage of the future, like possible referendum or whatever. So I've got a wee bit more hopefulness that we, there is another agenda happening. Yeah, I understand the future, but why not?
Right, thanks, Frida.
I think,
Joe.
I think taking back to a couple of points, you mentioned at the start Beth Winter, right? I was with Beth Winter in Wales a couple of weeks ago speaking at a festival and that, and the Welsh Labour Party's obviously taken a very different position on the constitutional question that the Labour Party took in 2014. A more grown-up conversation, shall we say, about our constitutional position, and that's what I said to the audience, because before we were speaking on community wealth building that afternoon, there was a session with the Yes Cymru organisation talking about the ins and outs of Welsh independence and the benefits from them. And I think my point that meeting, Vince, is what you're saying. My warning to them was you need to take that type of approach and you need to insert a bit of class politics into it. Because the danger and the problem that we've got now, Frida, unfortunately, is there was no class element to the debate in 2014. So we have started to march up the top of the hill in terms of class politics again with the RMT, with the CWU strikes, with the industrial strategy for Unite under Sharon Graham, etc. The problem in Scotland is, does that start to march back down the hill as people get their soul tires back out? Does the fight for train drivers or railway workers, in the Royal Mail, does that get sidetracked with the whole constitutional debate? Because the Cole sitting next to you, Cole will tell you he chapped so many doors in North Ayrshire during the election between April and May. We were constantly told by people that they supported the policy agenda, but for them it was just independence. We needed to vote SNP because of independence. We don't actually oppose what you're doing, but it's independence.
Independence for North Ayrshire.
Well, it would be good. It would be good. But the point would be, I don't know whether or not some of that ship has sailed in terms of the debate. We're trying to insert class politics into a debate that's been going on for the best part of a decade.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. You want to say anything? Briefly.
Briefly, no. To be fair, no. I think I'll probably leave it at that because I think it's going to be said.
Right. John.
Yeah, just carrying on the points yeah, we do face a massive challenge in terms of the polarisations debate, but I think it is a different situation to 214, and that's because of the features that have been discussed. We've got a class mobilisation on wages that's going to affect almost everybody. We've also got a mobilisation that is likely to take place on services, because council services are going to be cut with the money, and they're already appalling. And in order to win many of these fights, because the fight is going to be particularly strong in the public sector, the private sector to some extent are giving the wages, if they need the labour, they can't give them any other way. That is going to be, if they're going to be one, it's going to be some kind of unity between the services provided to people and those who receive them. And I think that's why an organisation like this is so important, that it can, in that process, inject the politics. And we talked about the centralising agenda and the levelling up agenda of Boris Johnson. The key thing to remember at the heart of that is that his restructuring of local government is about, and it's in the document, the levelling up document published a few months ago, unleashing the power of the private sector in order to achieve it. So it's the reverse of what Joe and others have been attempting to do. We need to get that through to people there, and we also need to expose what the SNP are up to. Because it's simple neoliberalism and hiding behind the salt iron. So it's initiatives like what we've heard from Wyndford, linking it up in communities, but giving it that wider politics that we need. I've always thought it was a pity that community wealth building was called community wealth building, not community power building. Wealth seems to, well, be something that goes in the other direction, but it is about community power building, like it was in the 1920s, the 30s, when the first of the council services were being developed. It's about freeing people from dependence on private landlords, freeing people from dependence on the private sector, the oppression of capital. It's about building that power in the community. And that, I think, is the politics that we somehow got to get across. And I think Rose is one of the organisations that can do that. So I'd appeal to people to kind of be active within it, and also to take away the materials over there and get them out so that people know what we're doing this. We go on the Rose website, which is, I think, quite a good website now, so everybody can get access to it. Yeah. And we'll hopefully print the proceedings as well in the next newsletter.
Yeah, thanks, John. That brings me on basically to the final point about the organisation. I mean, there was 20 in attendance here tonight, plus 12 on Zoom. If you haven't joined the organisation, please do so. It only costs you $5, you know, as an individual. You can participate in the debates, assist in drawing up the bulletins and indeed the newsletters that we do. Take an active part to communicate what we're about into the communities that we're privileged to serve. And if you do that, by the way, I, as a chair, will have done a job of work to convince as many people to join the organisation, because, you know, without an organisation such as this, how can we send solidarity, greetings, support to community organisations if we're not really organised ourselves properly? And I think that's vital. The question of
You've got Willie.
Right, Willie, I'll get you in a minute, Willie. I didn't see your hand. The question of the affiliation is an individual £5. Local organisations or branches is a tenner, and regional level is 50 quid. And of course, John mentioned the website, https://rose-scotland.org. It's been updated and it's very good. And there's some actual video explainers. I don't know what that is, but there's some short clips of a video in relation to what we're about. So that in itself is obviously hopeful. Wally, what you want to say?
Well, thank you very much, my friend. Thank you very much, brother.
Of
Firstly,
course, you're fighting to see you.
well, that's not a problem. Actually, I sent my check off today to Jim McDade.
Good man. Good man.
For his fiver. It was just a cheeky and a wee humorous thing. With we were talking about you know, the bus fares, you know, and the tickets with the wee woman for Shettleston. I mean, as an ex-professional driver myself, Eastern Scottish and that sort of thing, and a CPC national and international holder of road transport passenger operations, how it actually works, it goes in fare stages. You know, you're probably similar to yourself, as you know, Phil, you know, within the train industry. Bus companies, they can be ruthless, depending on the most profitable route. Going from point A to point B, they put in certain fare stages. Now, that could be between 1 stop or 3 stops or 4 stops. Perfect example is Edinburgh LRT, public owned. They have a single fare of £1.80 because they registered one fare stage between one terminus and the second terminus. So it's £1.80. Whereas you get, like, say, where I stay in Renfrewshire, you've got McGill's. You could have a service that runs for a total distance of 3 miles, but they've maybe got 6 fare stages within that point. And even when I was driving buses, you always knew that the busiest stop you would get, because people would walk that extra 100 yards just to get to that fare stage. That would then take them a further half-mile down. So unfortunately, it's not that they're being fraudulent. It's just the way that the system works on the traffic commissioner for the fare stage.
Right, okay, Wally, I need to stop you because Kenny wants to say a few words. We've got to go here for 9 o'clock. Thanks very much for your contribution. Well, look, sorry about that, Kenny. I don't know how to fix it. Right, it's 9:15. Finally, colleagues, I want to record my appreciation and thanks to the speakers for their excellent contributions. And I also want to say that your solidarity message that you mentioned, I'll pass it on, and my members and the reps and everybody else associated with the strike would appreciate that. I'll finish up by saying this, and I say it a lot of times when there's been on demonstrations on the picket line and down at Kerr and Ryan and all that kind of stuff. When I joined the NUR, as it was then, and it was the NUR National Union of Railwomen, and that speaks volumes in the first place, doesn't it? But I was always intrigued by Rule 1, Clause 1, to work for the supersession of the capitalist system by a true socialistic order of society. Now, what's not to like about that?
That's a good place to start.
And, you know, that's been a watchword, by the way, of our union. It was carried forward with the merger of the NUS to form the RMT. And that is a principle that me as a long-time serving member, previous organizer and so on and so forth, chair of the STC and all that kind of stuff. Thanks very much for your attendance. Fill in the sediment sheet with your emails and stuff like that. You want to get involved, more than welcome. John and Vince are the secretaries, and they'll deal with everything that you want. So thanks very much for your attendance. Have a safe journey home, colleagues. Much appreciated. Cheers.